about how useless and horrible they are, how they are autistic and horrible and retarded and da. If you insult someone and stalk them and was kind of clinical. You know, the horror of the First World War was that it was a meat grinder. And your body reacts like you're in danger, and it's quite the rush. But just like with a horror movie, if you're not careful, you'll get nightmares. Only it's worse with utopia without a little bit of horror. But on the other hand, if you have a kind of cyberpunk dystopia, people just, hey, we're pushing through the updates, and hey, fuck you! You know, sort of, you know, my ex told me horror stories of people who have exposing the horrors of the world and sort of, you know, shining the light. In the fiction I write, yes, there is horror and there is terror and there is inequality and oppression. Tragedies in these other countries are lesser. I'm not saying these other horrors in these other countries are lesser. I'm just saying spit roast. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. Let the horror sink in. Oh, by the way, since apparently Lenin to return to Russia, sending off the waves that will allow all this horror to happen. There's issues. It's like why I don't go to horror movies, because I'm just not that stupid. I don't like being scared. I'm not going to William Dixon Wright, and it was, you know, one of the great horrors that the Logicios had been doing, where essentially they had been. Pregnancy's a horror show. It is an utter fucking horror show. I'm like, absolutely. I'm not having a go. So, if you like hammer horror, if you like, if you like Family Guy, if you like stupid, you know, you can't even go into the whole horror of, well, it wants to do horrible things to this girl and use her and possess her and stuff. And the start of the real horrors to come. Because make no mistake, there will be any outright horror. There isn't anything that sticks out as wrong or disgusting, or he tries to catch and help man. It's a moment of abject horror. Oh no, I'm thinking of fuck rapists from the kind of fetishized, romanticized, fancy horror story rapist who's like a supernatural the love interest or the horror be something that is specific to the character, so that the reader, the graphicness and the horror, you know. Then if you have to do it, and I don't know why I am removing the shock and horror of Clara's death, but because it was to look at the sheer stark horror of how our lives are fucked over by just happenstance and coincidence. That those implications don't have to be nasty. That this doesn't have to be a horror story about artificial intelligence is taking over the earth. But honestly, if he continues on like this with like the Crimson Horror, he might be able to do that. No, because quite frankly, the horror of the change that's happening to me because my biology is fucked at the. The Battle of Cannae-esque, hands-on, front lines, blood, guts, and horror. And it's this horrible joining where you see this genuine, like, moment of horror as these punks tear apart someone in the tube, and it's just
7, 8 are kind of just like horror, doom, dark, death. It's like, oh, to write a Lovecraftian horror level of wrong. I mean, you know, there's this last year, you know,
the hots for a transsexual, oh poor you, or they're used as horror, you know. Oh my god, this woman turns out she's a.
Here's the thing, guys. Fucking Where Sylph Dawning, my fucking dystopian horror show.
Either I give in to preventing the minor horror of there might be something there that could get.
Day. Because it's tradition. Christmas Day horror films, it's a tradition, you know. It started with the thing.
But again, that's the sort of thing of, oh well, if it isn't a horror film, then it's kind of boring because.
Look, said Eliza, coldly dispassionate in the face of such horror. She must be used to the barbarity of the country outside by now. He's left just. That's a thing that is very true about the horrors of communism, about the horrors of 1984 and V for Vendetta and things like that.
It is kind of subsumed by just a massive gaping maw of horror and squeak, and I'm just. Were ideological. The horrors that the Soviets committed against the Germans were
Advertising myself so that I was no longer afraid of horror and stuff like that. Like, have I been going about things the right way? I think I am just about over the horror of our stuff. Like,
of describing just enough that you realise the full horror of the situation and are justly
cheap films to make. If you want to do a cheap, schlocky horror film, zombies. All you need is a bit of makeup, right? On horror, or that they just did on the creatures of the night.
Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Horror of the Heights, The Terror of Blue.
We are talking about people who, like, who have body horror kind of fetishes, you know. I don't need to know the full extent of the horrors that have gone on, and I have no doubt that just through sheer osmosis might be, you know, a genuine amount of horror at the idea that anyone would ever go through with such a thing. I think it was the Rocky Horror Picture, Rocky Horror Picture Show, although that review I might have listened to, actually dwelling on the horror of the scene, and sort of showing it for what it is.
Not be crushed under the weight of the horror, and bear in mind, it was. I mean, yes, okay, the First World War did pretty much result in, conceptually, what I find terrifying is, as in genuinely horror, scary stuff, is this whole idea to court, to see that they are tried fairly, and to see that the horrors that they suffered are not.
Right? Like, it completely undercuts the horror. So you want the horror to be unseen, and this is why actually we'll be doing is watching a horror film for Christmas Day, because it's tradition. Christmas Day horror films. He is going out, he is seeking out, and he is searching out horrors who are committing dreadful acts, the genocidal, and he
show you what you've all been asking for. Here, feast upon my grotesque body horror tits. Feast upon them. Wank off! The media works, and what this Cecil the Lion thing is that. Okay, it is that horror story of, oh, news breaks. Oh, it gets... Because as I say, there is no medium that can accurately reflect the horror of the First World War, because people get bored after a while.
4 years, 8 years of horror. What happens when the neoliberal that was supposed to steady the boat?
Probably gonna piss yourself. The utter disgust and horror of feeling these things growing and shrinking, these things that are utterly...
Because this is where it gets really freaky. Because this is where the horror is that it becomes how everyone was thoroughly doomed, and how all these little things played into it, and the horrors, you know. I mean, I no longer give a fuck anymore. I've seen the horrors that pet ownership creates. So I'm kind of quite distracted from the full, you know, bleak Kafka horror of and also because it's basically saving someone from the horrors of Markov, which is nice. So I might do some of the quest lining now, and the reason Brett and Ladedja sort of watches this with horror, like, you fucking enjoyed that. If you don't think Alien is a horror film, if this doesn't scare you, then let the horror show begin. That transgender people have to deal with. I've seen a tiny fraction of the existential horror that you get when you look in the mirror. I've seen a ton of dangers in the world today, a lot of horrors in the world today. But by and large, the horrors we face, portions of the brain. You can't let the horror become boring. And it has to happen within a short period of time. I am become death, destroyer of worlds. The horrors I have wreaked upon this world. Of fiction, and therefore some altered permutation of horror, and therefore the ways in which you will suffer will continue and continue. I mean, people talk about Game of Thrones and how, but it's horror on Game of Thrones. And a particular party is carrying out austerity. Austerity's horror. I don't go in for this party politics. I don't go in for people politics. Like a scene in a horror movie where you look in. I see what is happening in the world right now. I see the racism and the horror, and I don't fucking like it. Fucking shaky cam zombie horror film, and it's just like, that's so much easier to do than, yes, we're gonna make a cinematic. Strange things fascinating, because the intersection between horror and romance and between horror and romance and sort of sci-fi.
4 hours of just building tension and like a car crash and a horror movie and
This is one that could very easily be a horror movie. So yeah.
because the only way to do so is through blood and horror. Did we say after the British Empire? Well, you know what?
Such a good day. It's such a fucking good day. There is horror in the world. Writing this dark stuff is just the sort of fascination with the horror of relationships that seem okay, that
Everything about the alien is just betrayal. It is sexuality as horror coming to destroy you. People who have survived through that and all these horrors. And it is an utterly amazing book. What was it?
But that is a very effective way to do horror, is to not show the monster, but to focus on the terror that it causes. It's stories. And you get the horror story. So the first thing to notice about Windows 10 is that
and that horror is something that's always like within the Freaky Friday
on another sensation, and you would be seeing it either as horror, or if it happened after that point, it'd be this very weird, oh, I bet he
talking about stuff, and it's, I mean, sort of, if it's a horror film, this is really good because it's scared.
The Tories, oh, you never know what they're gonna do. And we were having all these horror stories about what's gonna happen and their budgets and all kind of just like horror, doom, dark, death. It's like, oh, okay. Hell of a sort of journey to go, waiting for your body to regrow. That's the true horror. So the idea I essentially wrote Fuzzy Logic basically as an excuse.
Eats atrociously, who drinks atrociously, and who spends his life investigating horrors. He's got a dark soul. So my review of the Crimson Horror. Let's start the timer. Yeah.
Like one of these Facebook things saying like, tell a horror story in 6 words, and you can absolutely say horrible things in 140 characters. But pregnancy is a horror show, so I can entirely understand, like, at this point in technology, or in any of these other, criticisms of the horrors that the state capitalism of communism ended up. And maybe this is why there's such a load of survival horror games, such a load of apocalypse games as a slur. They are saying, how dare you, you're horrible, you're a horror, you're gonna do terrible things to us.
Were shark, right? And it was like kids around a campfire telling horror stories, and this thing is out to get
completely fucking terrified of all kinds of shit. I don't watch fucking horror films. There's a reason why on fucking Halloween be a complete shithead, You can have oases of horror, and I have a healthy respect and hatred for films. And because they were a horror creature, they were supposed. It was okay that they had this specific set of rules and that they were. I know
know that I'm kind of undergoing a kind of eldritch body horror at the moment, but I'm not really someone that you would think of as saying, now that's a man.
Words cannot fucking describe the terrors and the horrors and just when, you know, masturbation is a reminder of this Lovecraftian horror, right? On horror, or that they just did, on the creatures of the night.
Except I am safe with this reality, then you get the full total horror and your brain just shuts it out because it can't happen. Laura was silent in fascinated horror as she circled the horse with the head and chest of a human. Like the Crimson Horror, he might be able to do that. Because the Crimson Horror wasn't fun. It's like at a certain point, if you keep seeing horror over and over again, you just get acclimated to it and you go, oh no, that's...
Of evil people investigating the Tomb of Horrors. And that kind of worked, because it was the sort of situation of, we're all sort of trapped here and we're...
destruction and glib horror. And just... where kind of horrid, violent death is used as a punchline.
People, as they saw what entered and gasped in horror, we turned to look, me and Eliza. It was a shambling thing. A good half of its eyes were popped. To an extent, you know, they're kind of right to be paranoid, because, like, there are so many horror stories of women who are just like, you know...
And that's kind of partly just, you know, nice horror touch. But partly it's that, you know, I got bullied a lot. I got bullied an awful lot, and so...
Boys saying, witness me, you know, it's like, as I go to Valhalla, I say the war cry, and I let it be known that I existed, you know.
You know, logically, that, you know, women should be killed and eaten. The utter horror of that. You take that and then you...
Their whole lives. It's horrible. It's a Lovecraftian horror, and these people live with it every day.
You can kind of understand it, you know, the horrors that the Nazis committed.
I mean, this is sort of almost, you know, why horror is fascinating. I don't know.
Kind of the horror of fucking farming. I agree that killing animals is wrong. I agree that...
today. But by and large, the horrors we face are by idiots. We do not face any grand master plans. We do not face any
lengths to explain what horrors are done to ensure, like, they will give you hope, because with hope you can suffer. And I know so many people I know so many horror stories of people who, like, start dieting.
kind of 5, 6, 7, or films 5, 6, 7, 8 are kind of just like horror, doom, dark. How could I forget the Tomb of Horrors? How could I forget the Tomb of Horrors? But yeah, I played... Okay. I shall listen to the one on the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and I have learned Switch and Red Dead Redemption, and then I think it was the Rocky Horror Picture, Rocky Horror Picture Show, although that...
When I was feeling low, he's a trusted ally. Ace sent off to sort of learn about the horrors going on, and she sort of learned that, yeah, Hitler...
The hero of this sort of political horror story, and I'm listening through the School of Movies back catalogue, where I'm having to listen to their horror reviews, and I've just listened. And, you know, they were starving and they had gone through untold horrors. Because Stalin's the ultimate pragmatist, okay? So you've got wisdom, and then the Tomb of Horrors happened, and he made it out of the Tomb of Horrors alive. And so I'm in Woking now, so I scream and scream and scream. And so this is the horror of war. It would be a huge.
David stared at the creature that was once his friend as he realised the full horror of what was charging before them. It was
were doing their best to survive horrors that are just unimaginable in this time. Partly because as like the mundane horrors of the world taking a surreal twist into the blackly comic, and would just take the darkness and substitute it with all kinds of horrors. And, you know, there would be monsters.
And so basically, yeah, what happens to the chickens is a horror show. But at the same time, I like the chickens. Yes! The rebels are fighting back! Oh my gosh! Shock horror! Women are not putting up with the fact that we sexually object. The same kind of effect I'm going for as the effect of Jaws, whereby you increase the horror of Jaws by not showing the shark until the end, and that you make the horror the horror be scary to the character. You make it doesn't. Being a fucking tyrannical horror does not make your side look like the fucking good guys.
No, that my review of Listen is basically fantastic. Great psychological horror. Basically explains the entirety of the Doctor's. You didn't know the horrors you are unleashing, but no. I think I can take it. That I think I'm fine with.
That's just telling, you know, a horror story. That's just, and this is why they're horrible douchebags, right? You know.
It's just, and here comes the fuck truck. Here comes the horror and pain and torment, and I'm
for me is the big thing. It's the big, you know, horror, right? It doesn't matter which particular
kind of understandable reasons given all of the horrors that had happened to them, but
is 9 months of hellish torture followed by a horror scene that the woman has to live through. When I write those scenes, it's never just, you know, the kind of humour or horror or whatever of the situation. It's also, to a certain extent, exactly like the very horror it is intended to be fixing. Okay, and so therefore, you know, viewing myself in the third person when that's going on, almost watching horror movies with myself as the victim. As I end up watching the Christmas Day horror film at, I was about to say at home, but what I mean is like in
needed. Okay, it did a valuable job. Lots of horrors were committed, lots of money was generated, lots of technology. Actually makes you more jaded when eventually the the bits of horror do come up in the later parts. So all that, the horror of the First World War was that it was a meat grinder. The horror of the Eastern Front on the Second World War was too.
And obviously, I hadn't watched the kind of horror movies and I didn't have the kind of understanding of biology.
That is, but nevertheless, I'll try not hammer on too much about why William Dafoe's character is cliche and is so much worse than everything else, because rape is the horror that people live with, and like I have had issues that happened in the First World War, and again, like the horror of the First World War for the Brits is, funnily enough, it's the argument Kihar made in the whole horror in the whole forced to confront how he has changed, how the horrors of the world have changed him, how he went from so I did watch The Alien. It was my Christmas Day horror film. And it was scary. The little kid is washed up on British beaches, but I don't care. I'm gonna say my abhorrent opinion anyway. Blah. I genuinely hate UKIPers, but the first part, minus last 2 hours, is basically constant squick and horror and nastiness, because you've got,
and most of them hate my guts because they're Nazis who weirdly decide, yes, we shall hover around this person that we hate and think. And then it gets like, there have been horror stories of people who are like, hey, and Donald Trump was an irrelevancy compared to the horror of Hillary Clinton, and that alone was enough to get me targeted. What the horror of the First World War was like. Because I have listened to Dan Carlin's type of, I just do the best I can. I have lived with this horror, and we won last time. We survived. We built a colony. Ice Warriors Mark Gatiss, but yeah, this is another Mark Gatiss thing, and oh, I wish it wasn't, because it's horror and it's comedy and on the edge of committing an unspeakable act of horror against myself. I'm the guy urging me to do it. Stolen from them. One mad motherfucker is still patriotic despite witnessing the horror, and he says, you know what, we could have won that downfall or something, but essentially you have it be a horror movie from the perspective of Skynet. Fucking was under Stalin, like you cannot look at the horror show that communism became under Stalin and say, he's a fellow human being, you do not need to spew rage and horror at him because he has made some songs that I do not like, and he's school. I know where that leads. Okay, I have had the full horror story about what happens if you let jokes against yourself, because I have seen these horrors that normal feminists don't blink about. They're just like, well, of course not all feminists. But just from reading TV tropes and stuff like that, in fact, just knowing vaguely the kind of horrors, reading this, there are times when shit just gets so bad you need a way out. Although granted, there are horror stories you hear of just cats and dogs, benefit functions, and all of the horror that is going on in the world at the moment. And to be honest, in many ways, I don't feel like I need. It was not nice. That was not nice at all. That was just pain and horror and like, I really cared for these. Then it's completely, then either it's an utter horror thing, or it's a kind of sweet thing, but not cause them to fail. And that, you know, the idea that, you know, the true horror of the culture is that, and you know, in the kind of the great horror sort of thing, you know, to quote Matt, there's sort of, if you're going to write a romance or a horror story, there are sort of two ways to do it. The first way to do it is to, and I've been listening to the British History podcast, learning about all the horrors that Brits have done. No, we're not doing that. We're gonna each vote with our guts. And we were getting horror stories. We were being told that, you know. And then you get the horror stories. Then you get the horror stories. And mundane than that, you know, almost fantasized horror version of rape. It sort of reminds me of sort of like the horror from Day of the Triffids isn't the physical threat the Triffids pose. Weaker troops fell back and fell back and fell back, and then they just encircled the Romans. And the horror was, I mean, the Battle of Cannae actually, it's what, like, there is a lot of fridge horror there, a lot of, okay, so the xenomorphs aren't just weapons. Words cannot fucking describe the terrors and the horrors and just the sheer horror of how it is done, of just Reese Shearsmith's character, just of the First World War, because people get bored after a while. So yeah, the horrors that went on are that, you know, I can absolutely see that this would be a horror movie. But that kind of is my jam. What's my, you know, horror thing is the monster. For me it shocks, you know, because obviously, first memory. Lisa chuckled. Gret is very kind and sensitive to horror. Then she added as an afterthought, Carla would love the kind of, yeah, this is totally fine and okay. Oh wait, no, it's just genuinely a horror story, like the 50 Shades of Grey thing is. The modern internet horror story, like how someone doing something shamelessly on the internet, because rape's a fucking horrible thing, so you are gonna have a full-on, like, horror thing of jump scares and boom! Short, messy black hair and a stench of death about him entered. Nicky stared at him for a moment, frozen in horror. Your name's Nicky, right? Said the strange man. This probably looks a little bit like a villain in a horror movie. Maybe this isn't such a hot look for me. Stand on the battlefield, and war was a very personal, hands-on thing. It was, and the horror of the Battle of Cannae is the fact that you're a situation, because I saw tremors of the plague. I saw tremors of the great black horror that is festering. He made it through. He made it through and he worked with them, and then the Tomb of Horrors happened and he made it out of the tomb. And Ghost Shark it's a truly, like, Stephen Moffat kind of horror. It's that kind of concept of taking something. If, however, it isn't a horror film, if, however, you think I'm being a massive wuss, then, yeah, it's a shit film. So I don't have to deal with the horrors of that, but at the same time, Britain is still in fucking Brexit limbo. You know, it'd be like if you had some sort of big cat horror story and it turned out it was just a little tabby cat, right? Like, it completely I have learned that I never want to watch the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It is not my cup of tea. Not my cup of tea at all. We did our time, and, you know, almost in a way, Churchill and the Second World War and you know, the horror that is the madness to show effectively the stark horror in a way that isn't gonna overload the care on Facebook, like this kind of horror story that I could kind of imagine happening, you know? I'm gonna tell you it now. And opens the door, oh my fuck, there's a lot of birds there. Like, it's stupid horror story stuff, like, you know, oh really? Gut-wrenching things to read is just the horror of humanity. And in this scene, you see the same thing. But, and we went into the Tomb of Horrors, and my character got out and survived, and almost like, you know, Jason versus Jaws. You know, it is a proper sort of horror movie slasher film. Trying to make a living out of my rage at the horrors of the fiction I have to sit through. So yeah, I get it. It's fine. Like, if I'm gonna play the Tomb of Horrors, I'm playing the Tomb of Horrors. I know what I'm gonna expect. If, however, because it will become the example of, look at the horrors that these people support. And so it makes money. And because it makes money, the car crash ends in that kind of horror, then there's kind of part of me that's just like, I want. And certainly certain people committed great horrors against the Germans, but for kind of understandable reasons, given, I'm like, okay, I will take the utter horror thing interpretation and I will make it into the sweet thing interpretation. And I've seen some people who disagree about the idea that Alien is a horror film. And they seem to still love Alien, the film, and it's like, oh. So yes. And also I've realised to my horror that kind of, I have choice now. At first, and then it just sort of becomes a horror story, because hamsters die, and yeah. It was amazing. The trick with the cricket ball, and, you know, John Smith, and just the horror of John Smith, the fact that, I guess I was lucky, really. I was one of the first to go. I didn't fully know of the horror that waited in store, and I didn't really